Hey, what is up guys, Mergaman4 here, and today I'm very excited to be diving into some 60s Doctor Who, the first to be released in the collection range. I have a very soft spot for this era of the show. I adore the black and white, the Doctor and companions are given even more depth than most others, helped by the fact that the seasons were a lot longer, so could afford more quiet moments. And at this point in the show, despite the budget limitations, it truly felt like anything was possible, that we really could go anywhere in time and space. The ambitions are so much higher than the available resources, and that just shines through. Honestly, I think 60s Who is when the show is at its most magical. It was often far from perfect, but I can't help but love it nonetheless. And Season 2 is certainly no exception. So why don't we take a look? It's no surprise to see Season 2 as the first 60s release of the collection. It's the shortest of the period, has the fewest missing episodes, and the episodes it is missing are extremely unlikely to be animated anytime soon. And it's got an excellent variety of stories to boot, including numerous firsts that would change the future of Doctor Who forever. And it all starts with Planet of the Giants. Recycling an idea originally conceived for the very first Doctor Who story, Planet of Giants is an oddity in Doctor Who history. It's effectively a modern-day pure historical, with no alien or sci-fi menace outside the TARDIS crew being really small. It's also unique in that the main villain of the piece is never once made aware that the Doctor and co are even present, let alone directly interact with them. And for a third thing, it's also the only story in Doctor Who history to have an entire episode's worth of material removed in the edit, condensing down what was scripted and filmed as a 4-parter into the show's first, and for over 2 decades only, 3-parter. So how is the end result? Well, to be perfectly honest, I think it certainly benefits from the cutdown. I enjoy the concept, and largely the execution, but I definitely think an additional 25 minutes would be stretching the material thin. And it's a fairly smooth edit at that, perhaps proving how unnecessary a 4th episode was. If I didn't know the situation, I honestly don't think I'd have noticed anything missing. So, what about what did make it to screen? Well, for one thing, on a 60s budget, I actually think most of the effects are rather well done. The sets, particularly inside the house, are very effective and do a great deal to sell the premise. The insects, a tad less so, though it certainly helps that most of them are meant to be dead. And the one living fly we see is surprisingly full of life, with some clever camera work helping the imagination fill in what the limited movement can achieve. I also enjoy how the TARDIS crew is able to gradually piece together what's going on amongst the full-size people, and do what they can to put a stop to it. It's a very unconventional threat for the show, since, as previously mentioned, the villain is never actually aware of the TARDIS crew's presence. And even without giant cats and draining sinks, there's a looming sense of doom from the chemical DN6, which Barbara accidentally infects herself with, and is too ashamed to tell the others about. On the whole, it's a fairly simple story, and not one that's likely to be considered amongst the show's early triumphs, but it's fun for what it is, and is certainly unique in Doctor Who's history. And for that, I think it deserves a reasonable 7.5 out of 10. The Dalek Invasion of Earth. Doctor Who's first blockbuster, so to speak. And far more than that. The first extensive use of location filming, as well as Doctor Who's first of many quarries, the first invasion of our planet, the first return of an existing monster, and the first companion departure. I think it's safe to say that the Dalek Invasion of Earth did a lot to cement Doctor Who's future, and the show's history would look very different without it. Or, indeed, may not have had much more history at all. And I think this story very much lives up to the hype. For one thing, bringing the alien menace close to home, albeit in the future, and seeing the Daleks in iconic locations rather than stuck in a small studio the entire time, makes the story feel both much more personal and far grander in scale than their previous outing. For another, it's a 6-part story that doesn't outstay its welcome. The previous Dalek serial begins to feel a bit repetitive after a while, but the Dalek Invasion of Earth does enough to keep building towards the climax without having to run around in circles. This is helped massively by giving each of our leads a different role in the story, separating them early on and also giving us a variety of pairings rather than keeping certain characters together for the entire runtime. As a result, we get to see many different facets of the Daleks' invasion and its effect on the people of Earth, from the independent rebel cells to the slave workers in the mines, to those desperate to survive at any cost, and to those converted into Robomen. It's a story of many strands, and each feels like it's suitably paid off. And it's great that a classic story of this length actually takes advantage of its runtime to tell these stories rather than being hindered by it. And of course, we can't talk about the Dalek invasion of Earth without discussing Susan, who becomes the very first companion to leave the Doctor, or perhaps more accurately, to be left by the Doctor. This is the first of a few companion departures to revolve around them falling in love with someone they've only recently met, and while I don't think this is quite the best example of how to do it right, it certainly isn't the worst either. For the most part, David and Susan's relationship is built up quite well throughout the story. The moment where they share their first kiss is incredibly natural and quite surprising for the 60s, only to be promptly interrupted by the Doctor, and it's a nice touch that rather than wholeheartedly throwing herself into this new life, Susan is put into a difficult dilemma, not wanting to leave her grandfather. So it's fascinating to see the Doctor make that choice for her, becoming one of very few companions who the Doctor has given up rather than have taken away. The resulting speech, probably the first Doctor's most iconic moment, is beautifully performed by Hartnell and leaves you with a bittersweet tear in your eye. All in all, I think it's pretty obvious I'm a big fan of this story. It's got the action and the stakes, the emotion and the character, and sets up so much of what's to come in the show's future. For me, and I'm sure for many others, the Dalek invasion of Earth is a defining story of the 60s, one that I would say is easily worthy of a 9 out of 10. Well, after the grand skill of the last story, we transition to a much simpler affair. One of the show's rare two-parters, which introduces us to new companion Vicky. The Doctor, Ian, and Barbara, now without Susan, demonstrated by a touching moment from the Doctor, not yet used to her absence, land on the planet Dido, where a colony ship has crashed with just 2 survivors. We swiftly meet Vicky, and she makes an immediate impression. In fact, I think the smaller scale of the story helps greatly in establishing her character and letting us into who Vicky is, through her ability to find joy in the small things, her willingness to help, but also her fierce dedication to fighting for what she believes in. Filling a similar role to Susan, it's very easy to compare the two, and while I don't dislike Susan by any means, it's immediately apparent that Vicky is an improvement, both more likable and more capable. As for the plot itself, Coquillian provides an intriguing mystery. The fact that he's secretly Bennett is both well set up and a surprising twist. It's fun watching back the story knowing the outcome and noticing the hints towards the truth. And his motivations are suitably human. Insane, as the Doctor says, but human. It's very easy to buy into and satisfyingly answers the questions built up over the course of the story. Unfortunately, the climax isn't so well crafted, with the Didonians, who up to now were believed to be extinct, suddenly appearing just in time to save the Doctor, and Bennett being so freaked out he doesn't watch his footing and falls to his death. But on the whole, it's a fairly enjoyable serial and a solid introduction to Vicky. The Rescue gets a 7.5 out of 10 for me. And so we reach our first historical story of the season. And in a deviation from past ones, it was decided to make the Romans a comedy. It was surprising for me to learn that for some, this was actually a controversial decision, because for me, this works brilliantly. It's great fun seeing the story open with the Doctor and his companions just relaxing and having a good time. Moments like these really give a good insight into the characters and their relationships, and make them feel extremely relatable. Soon enough, of course, our leads are embroiled in trouble. Ian and Barbara are captured as slaves, while the Doctor and Vicky get caught up in a case of mistaken identity, ending up as guests in the court of Emperor Nero. This split is very effective for 2 reasons. Firstly, it allows us to explore 2 different sides of Roman culture, the highest of the high and the lowest of the low, as well as giving us a great running gag where the 2 groups have frequent near misses with one another. I will admit, I find the Ian and Barbara strand of the storyline to be far less interesting than the Doctor and Vicky one, and aside from the mentioned near misses, it's rarely what comes to mind when I think of the story. But what that aspect of the story lacks, the other half more than makes up for. I always have a blast watching Hartnell's Doctor fumbling through his situation, and I think it's a strong contender for one of Hartnell's best performances. He's clearly having so much fun here, which in turn translates over to the viewer. The guest cast too are a lot of fun. Derek Francis as Emperor Nero provides a great many laughs, whilst also providing a credible threat due to his position of power and total lack of moral scruples. We also have the jealous wife Poppaea, one of very few aspects of the story to actually be played straight, and an unlikely ally in Tavius, part of a conspiracy to bring Nero down. All in all, this is a Doctor Who story that really doesn't take itself seriously. Given some of the subject matter, there's an argument to be made that it really ought to have. But honestly, I just have such a great time with this story that I really don't mind, especially when seriousness abounds in many of the other historicals. For me, this is a high point of the First Doctor's era, and one I always look forward to revisiting. It's an easy 9 out of 10. Oh, poor Web Planet. Frequently mocked and derided. And frankly, I can't say it's entirely undeserved. The whole production is indeed ridiculous, and its flaws are many. But I also can't help but admire it, to a point. And honestly, my issues are less to do with people in flimsy costumes and Vaseline-smeared camera lenses, and primarily just the length. Chop out 2 episodes worth, and I can very well see myself enjoying this story quite a bit. Because there is a lot that I like here. The genuinely alien atmosphere, the ethereal threat of the Animus, the ambition of the insectoid aliens. I think it's very rare that Doctor Who tries to stretch its budget so far, and I have to admire it for that. And, to be honest, a lot of it is decently executed. The first couple episodes do an excellent job of building up a mystery, making you feel like you truly are on an alien world, and that our leads are up against a completely unpredictable and very powerful threat. As I said, I think the story mainly suffers from spreading its plot too thin, so that by the time you reach episode 6, it's become incredibly tedious and almost a chore to get through. But in my opinion, the positive elements still shine through, and that's why I can't bring myself to truly dislike this story. Its faults are still many, and I won't be in a rush to return to Vortis anytime soon, but all things considered, I've seen a lot worse. And because of that, I'll be giving the Web Planet the positive edge with a 5.5 out of 10. And here we reach our second historical, and the only story of the season to feature missing episodes. In contrast with most of the other stories this season, I honestly don't have all that much to say about the Crusade. It's a fairly run-of-the-mill story which doesn't really push any boundaries or revolutionize the show in any way. But that's not inherently a bad thing. It's an enjoyable enough story nonetheless, and features 2 extremely memorable guest turns in the form of Jean Marsh and Julian Glover playing Princess Joanna and King Richard respectively. In particular, it's also a very strong outing for Barbara, who more than holds her own against kidnap and threats of torture, and Ian gets his fair share of action too. And I don't know, I guess that's all I really have to say about it. It may not be anything spectacular, but I still think The Crusade is worthy of a solid 7.5 out of 10. What is it about much derided stories with excellent first episodes? Seriously, episode 1 of the Space Museum is one of the most unique and trippy in the show's entire history, and I really wish more of the show felt like this. The TARDIS team are effectively ghosts throughout this first part, and the episode ends with an incredible cliffhanger where they see their future and realize time is about to catch up with them. Unfortunately for the Space Museum, the rest of the story doesn't really follow through on this. There is the overhanging threat of becoming eternal museum pieces that both we the audience and the characters are all too aware of, which does help set the other episodes apart. But other than this aspect, which the story fails to fully capitalize on, the Space Museum is quite a bog-standard affair with very little worth mentioning. Now, I say that, but the one way in which I differ from most other people is, I don't think the bog-standard stuff is actually bad. It's alright. Not great, but alright. And combine that with the magnificent opening, which admittedly does a lot of the heavy lifting. I could never place the story anywhere near the bottom of my ranking, and while I think a lot of the criticisms that people give the Space Museum are fair, I do think people tend to overlook the good in it. So, Sorry, Space Museum haters, this story's another 7.5 out of 10 from me. I wouldn't revisit it often, but that first episode alone makes it all worthwhile. I'm pretty conflicted about The Chase. It's another attempt at a comedy serial, but this time instead of a historical, it's a sci-fi tale with Daleks. But I don't know, I'm not convinced it works. I mean, don't get me wrong, it does have its moments, but I think there's a way to make the Daleks funny without diminishing their threat, and The Chase doesn't do a great job of striking that balance, in my opinion. It also doesn't help that some of the episodes, particularly parts 3 and 4, feel entirely like filler, as we flip from location to location and don't really get anything of substance. That isn't inherently a problem. I don't really think filler is a negative, so long as it's entertaining. But the thing is, while I enjoy each aspect in and of itself, having them back-to-back just becomes tedious for me, and it's a great relief when the story finally settles down on Mechanus. In fact, it really is the Mechanus stuff, and to a lesser extent the stuff that's said on Iridius, that saves the story for me. And I realize how ironic it is that my least favorite aspect of The Chase is the chasing, but I feel like that's where the Daleks have the best blend of comedy and threat, and where the most interesting ideas thrive. Okay, Iridius isn't exactly a shining beacon of creativity, but I actually really like the idea of a planet meant for a colony that never arrives, so the service robots take it over as their own. It's also here where we're introduced to Stephen Taylor, who makes an immediate impression through Peter Purves' brilliant performance. And of course, there's no way I can talk about The Chase without touching on Ian and Barbara's exit. Finally getting the opportunity to go home. It's a very bittersweet ending that leaves me both beaming and crying. And honestly, to this day, I don't think it's been matched. This is, in my opinion, the perfect companion departure. So, what do I make of The Chase with all those conflicting thoughts? On the one hand, it's hard for me to commend it too strongly since I find the middle a particular struggle to get through. On the other hand, I can't deny it has some pretty strong highs. So I think ultimately, The Chase is a story that is good on the whole, albeit one I'm alright to leave alone for a while. Because of that, I'll be giving it a score of 7 out of 10. And so we approach the end of Doctor Who's second season. But there's one more surprise in store. One so massive, I think it's safe to say it changed Doctor Who forever, in more ways than one. Up to this point, historicals and sci-fi never mixed, and indeed, that's how the Time Meddler begins. But as the name implies, there's much more at play than first meets the eye, in a mystery that's wonderfully teased out throughout the first couple episodes. Of course, with the benefit of nearly 60 years of hindsight and pure historicals being all but abolished for nearly as long, the prospect of a sci-fi twist appears business as usual. But in the context of the time, it was an absolute game changer. The fact that you have someone who's come back through time to change history, the exact opposite of the Doctor's MO at this point in time, is a great idea, and Peter Butterworth gives a superb performance as the monk, a character who bafflingly hasn't been seen on screen since 1966. It's especially great fun seeing Butterworth and Hartnell sparring off each other in the latter half of the story. And the further revelation on top of his meddling, that he has his own TARDIS and is another of the Doctor's people, is similarly jaw-dropping. Oh, to have seen this serial without the knowledge of what's to come. Additionally, this story serves as the first proper outing for Stephen, who proves himself very capable despite his skepticism. It's great fun watching him learn the ropes of traveling with the Doctor and coming to terms with the impossible, and he and Vicky have an immediate chemistry together. It's a real shame this TARDIS team dissipates so quickly. If I were to have one complaint about the Time Meddler, it's that the actual historical aspect is rather uninteresting and lacks fleshing out. It's mostly forgivable because the time period isn't the main focus, but it would have been nice if it had more impact nonetheless. Either way, the story is ultimately a triumph, and I have a great time every time I revisit it. Easily worthy of an 8 out of 10. So, that was Season 2. Still very early on in the show's life, but already it was shifting and changing, and I think it's fair to say that Doctor Who wouldn't be the show it is today had it been afraid to push boundaries and explore new territory in the way it did. And on top of that, it's a highly enjoyable run too. Out of the 9 stories on display, there's only one I'd consider less than solid, and even it has its moments. Add in the stellar main cast who you always feel right at home with, and I would say that Season 2 is my go-to comfort season. It might not be the best of the best, but I think I'll always be in the mood for what is, in my opinion, the definitive set of Hartnell stories. I just can't help but love it. And that's my thoughts on Season 2. Now, let's look at how it ranks in comparison to the other 11 seasons released in the collection so far. Firstly, I'd rank the stories in Season 2 as follows. The Romans and the Dalek invasion of Earth at the top, both with 9 out of 10s. Then the Time Meddler with an 8 out of 10. The Crusade, the Space Museum, the Rescue, and Planet of Giants, all with 7.5 out of 10s. The Chase with a 7 out of 10. And finally, the Web Planet with a 5.5 out of 10. Altogether, Season 2 receives an average score of 7.61 out of 10, placing it in 5th place out of the 12 seasons I've reviewed so far, just behind Season 23. Alongside Season 2, we also have some new additions to the categories of Decade and Doctor Era, with the 60s and William Hartnell's era respectively entering at the top of each category. When it comes to Season 2's writers, Dennis Spooner enters the ranking in 5th place, with his 2 stories giving him an average of 8.5 out of 10. Terry Nation comes next, with his 2 contributions for this season, raising his position to 16th, with an average of 7.5, followed by Glyn Jones and David Whitaker, also both with 7.5s, in 18th and 19th place respectively. Meanwhile, Louis Marks also increases his existing score to a 7 out of 10, bringing him up to 25th place. Finally, Bill Stretton's sole Doctor Who story places him 32nd with his 5.5 out of 10. Our first 60 set introduces Doctor Who's original producer, Verity Lambert, into the producers' ranking in 2nd place, hot on the heels of Philip Hinchcliffe. Season 2 also introduces 3 new script editors to the ranking, with David Whitaker and Donald Tosh bookending the season, stealing the top 2 spots with an 8.25 and 8 out of 10 average, respectively, and Season 2's primary script editor coming in 6th place with a 7.33 out of 10. As for the season's directors, Douglas Camfield ranks highest, in 11th place with a 7.67 average. The remaining 3 directors end up falling back-to-back between 19th and 21st place. Mervyn Pinfield with a 7.5, Christopher Barry with a 7.3, and finally Richard Martin with a 7.17. Season 2's premiere story, Planet of Giants, ends up around the middle of the premiere ranking, sandwiched between Robot and Attack of the Cybermen, and slightly increasing the premiere average to a 6.88. The Time Meddler fares slightly better in the finales, in 5th place, and for the first time brings the finale average above the premiere average, now with a 6.92. Season 2 also manages to place 1 story each in the top and bottom 10s, the Romans just scraping into 10th place, and the Web Planet coming in 7th from the bottom. As for the remaining stories, the Dalek invasion of Earth just misses out on the top 10 in 11th place, the Time Meddler places 20th, we get a run of 4 Season 2 stories in a row, with the Crusade, the Space Museum, the Rescue, and Planet of Giants placing between 37th and 40th, and the Chase follows close behind in 44th, out of a total of 68 stories. And there we have it, the first 60 set of the collection. This era will always hold a special place in my heart, and despite the budget limitations on clear display, the passion and imagination of those behind the show shines through. And nearly 60 years on, Season 2 has a timeless charm to it, unmatched by any other era of the show. I already can't wait for the next 60 set. But what are your thoughts on Season 2? Please let me know in the comments below. And with that, Murgaman 4, over and out, and I'll see you guys next time with Season 9.